Spare a thought for Armand de Vertot. An actor in one of the travelling troupes crisscrossing pre-revolutionary France, he did what actors have done since time immemorial. He walked out on his 3-year contract for a better engagement in Marseille and declined to pay the 3,000 livres penalty. What happened next was rather less timeless. A lettre de cachet, a sealed royal order allowing imprisonment without charge or trial, the most notorious instrument of Bourbon despotism, was procured against him. His stage wardrobe was confiscated, and he spent a month in a dreadful prison, breathing the vapour of a pestilential air, until every livre was paid. Now, you might assume the person wielding arbitrary royal power here was a duke, a minister, or at the very least an intendant. You would be wrong. It was his employer, a woman, a former courtesan, and the orphaned daughter of a provincial pinmaker. Her name was Marguerite Brunet, though France came to know her as La Montansier, and her story is a useful antidote to the comfortable assumption that people who claw their way up from the bottom of a rigged system will, upon arriving at the top, feel any particular urge to unrig it. Brunet was born in Bayonne in 1730. Her father, the aforementioned pinmaker, died when she was 5. At around 16, she moved to Paris, where an aunt introduced her to the capital's demi-monde of kept women and their aristocratic keepers. By the brutal standards of that trade, she did well. Her clientele came from the highest ranks. In 1750, a lover, newly appointed as a colonial intendant, took her to Martinique. When that cooled, she moved on to Saint-Domingue and reinvented herself as a marchande de mode, a fashion merchant. By 1753, she was back in France with a new name, Mademoiselle Montansier, and a clear-eyed strategy. Cultivate the courtiers who might prove useful later. Her first attempt at the theatre, made only in her 30s, practically retirement age for an actress of the period, was as a performer, bankrolled by a wealthy young lover, the Marquis de Saint-Comtesse. She debuted in Dunkirk and Nantes, playing mothers and queens, and the audiences were not kind. The problem, apparently, was her accent. The actor Fleury, who later worked for her, described her as méridionale, southern, in accent, in gestures, and in sentiments. Delightful at a dinner table, fatal in classical verse. However, and this is where she parts company with most failed actresses of the age, Montansier simply changed sides of the curtain. She formed her own troupe, took it to Amiens, Caen and Nantes in 1766, and 2 years later pulled off the coup of her life. The theatrical privilege of Versailles itself, plus the right to entertain the court wherever it travelled. A word about privileges, then, because this is where one needs to understand the context a bit. Provincial theatre, under the old regime, was a peculiar world. A privilege was an exclusive royal licence. Whoever held it for a town or province enjoyed a legal monopoly on performances there. Rival troupes were simply barred, and municipal authorities lost their traditional say over which players visited them. Better yet, the holder could levy the quart des spectacles, literally a quarter of the gross takings, on any acrobat, marionettist, or minor foreign troupe in their territory. Some collected it even in towns they never visited, starving them of entertainment altogether. This was the system Montansier used for her own advantage. Through the late 1760s and 1770s, she snapped up privileges across Brittany, Normandy, Picardy, and Anjou, building something like the Live Nation of the Ancien Régime, and running it with her lover and lifelong partner, the actor Neuville. Her political cover came from the most powerful women in France, First, Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, then Queen Marie Antoinette, who provided the support, permission, and land for a brand new playhouse in Versailles. The King and Queen attended its opening night in 1777. This was the empire in which poor de Verteuil learned what a labour dispute looked like. Mind you, royal favour cut both ways. Shielded by the Queen, her troupe staged French parodies of Italian operas at court in 1787, trampling the Comédie Italienne's exclusive rights. Monopolies, it turned out, were sacred when they were hers. Despite her ruthlessness, Fleury remembered her as a charming woman. Fair to her employees as far as her temper allowed, though not the least in the world a friend of order. Her days belonged to the theatre, her nights to the gambling table. When a Rouen audience threw a letter onto the stage in 1787 demanding the removal of several actors, she responded with a masterly contrite letter in the local press, bowing to the authority of the public and pleading for patience with a single tenor. Good tenors being rare, very rare. She knew precisely which audiences could be coerced and which had to be courted. Then the revolution arrived. The powers that be changed, and the tools of oppression were, if anything, sharpened. Montansier moved to Paris, opened a hugely successful theatre in the Palais Royal in 1790, and in August 1793, of all possible moments, inaugurated opposite the Bibliothèque Nationale a playhouse so magnificent that Parisians dubbed it the Théâtre des Trois Millions. However, a monument to luxury at the height of the Terror attracted attention of the worst kind. Hébert's news sheet accused her of financing her new theatre with highwaymen's loot, while on the 13th of November, 1793, Chaumette denounced her to the Paris Commune with the creative charge that the theatre had been funded by Marie Antoinette so that it might catch fire and burn down the National Library. The next day, the 63-year-old Montansier and Neuville were in prison. She survived, released in September 1794, and spent years suing for compensation. However, the pattern of her life now ran in reverse. The woman who had once wielded arbitrary power was reduced to petitioning it. An opera house opened in 1801 to woo Bonaparte failed. He refused to attend. The surrounding streets were too convenient for assassins. And by the end of 1802, she was in prison again, this time for debt. Her old Palais Royal theatre, meanwhile, was out-earning the opera itself, so naturally Napoleon evicted the troupe in 1806 on the grounds that it offended the dignity of the Théâtre Français next door, which was a rather nebulous charge, and that it was a notorious haunt of prostitutes. That was less spurious. The Arch-Chancellor Cambacérès was keeping one of its actresses. As you can imagine, his motives were not strictly artistic. She married Neuville at last in 1800, at 70. He died soon afterwards. Of her own death, my sources say nothing, though she lived long enough to see the Bourbons return and to write to Louis XVIII requesting a yearly benefit performance to support her old age, citing nearly 50 years of service to the French stage. She signed herself, with perfect accuracy and no false modesty whatsoever, the doyenne of the theatre directors of all France.